Beauty, thank you very much to AWI Extension New South Wales for having me. As Fiona alluded to, I run a consulting business based in northwest New South Wales. So I'm coming to you from Coonamble today. And the location where I live and work has dominated the way I've drafted this presentation today, because I wanted to focus on the plants and the risks that I know about and that I see in our environment. But I do urge you that wherever you're located around the country today, that it's really important that you get some local advice and talk to the people around you so that you know what your risks are for your specific environment and the season that you're having. We certainly are at the moment in a tale of two climates. So this is just an image of pasture biomass from a website called SIBO Labs. And if you haven't discovered SIBO Labs yet, put it on your to-do list. It's free to access, and you can set up your farm and you can look at the pasture on your farm from space. And while it's always good to have a walk through the paddock and have a look with your own eyes, it's a very useful tool when you're assessing things like ground cover and feed quality and quantity. But if you can just have a look at the map that's been generated there, you can see that particularly down in the southern part of New South Wales and down into Victoria, there's some really red areas, so some quite bare areas that are quite drought affected. Where I am, we were having a lovely summer until it stopped raining, so we're certainly very dry and definitely in the grip of the autumn feed gap that we experience. And then wherever Cyclone Alfred did decide to drop some rain, you guys are probably experiencing some flooding or certainly a very wet time. So each of those scenarios will generate its own risk in terms of plant poisoning. After rain and after flooding, you get a huge wash of seeds and plants in river systems and where floodwater's gone that you don't normally expect. You might have recent growth, and in drought or when the feed plain is declining, animals are starting to get hungry and they're starting to chase strange plants, and they'll eat whatever's available, particularly if it's green. So whether it's dry, whether it's green, wherever you are today, I hope some of this is relevant, but there'll certainly be different risk factors for you. So toxic plants are quite cool from a veterinary point of view because they usually are quite interesting to investigate, and they cause like some pretty cool pathology inside the animal. But when we think about it in terms of sheep, across the whole sheep industry, they really don't. There's a lot of other diseases that rate higher than them on the risk, on the important sheep diseases that cost the industry money. So if you have a look at the graph that I've just presented, this is from the cost of endemic disease update from 2022. But I'll turn my head sideways so you don't have to. Right up the end, the most important diseases is called perinatal mortality, which is deaths around the time of lambing for ewes and lambs, and then followed by internal parasites, difficulty lambing and lambs getting stuck, fly strike, weaner ill thrift, lice, mastitis, arthritis. And it's not until we get down here that we actually find perennial ryegrass toxicity. That's our first plant that pops up. And then if we go all the way down the bottom till our chart starts getting really tiny, we find PA poisonings or pyridine alkaloids, which are the plants that affect your liver. So there are a couple in that top list of diseases, but they rate lower down the scale. And so plant poisonings are something to be aware of, but there's lots of other diseases that are probably a bigger impact on your pocket and a bigger risk, and they deserve some attention as well. So bear that in mind. So no matter which plant we're dealing with, there is some common plant poisoning situations, and these themes are going to pop up over and over again in my presentation. The first is monocultures. So I know that it's really easy to grow a cereal crop, or it might be really easy to grow lucerne because it's easy to control the weeds and it's a really, universal sort of a diet for those animals. But animals don't actually like monocultures. They like nutritional variety and they like to have a pick and a selection. And so monocultures can be toxic in their own right if the plant itself in the monoculture has got some toxic principles, but it also can be toxic because the animals choose to go and eat everything else before they get to the monoculture. So bear that in mind. Hunger is the next situation. So particularly, say, animals let out of stockyards after, say, shearing or scanning or some other management procedure, and they're let out with an empty belly onto a fresh paddock. That can be a real risk factor. Weeds around the edge of the crop or lucerne or any sort of monoculture, we talked about that. Stock newly introduced to a paddock. So generally, stock, just by their very nature, they tend to eat less after lunch. So if we're going to shift paddocks, we always try and do it when the animals have got a full belly after lunch. So that either means we let them fill up with grass where they're currently grazing, or if we can't do that, we fill them up with hay or something like that and then put them out after lunch. That tends to be a better plan rather than first thing in the morning when they've got an empty belly from the night before. Stock recently purchased from other areas. So animals tend to adapt to their environment and they know the plants and they tend to eat, they get used to what they eat and they probably developed either some avoidance of some poisonous plants or some tolerance of the toxic compounds. But whenever as vets we see toxicities, they often are animals that have just been bought out of the sale yards or they've just arrived on a truck from another area and they've been put into a new paddock. So just look after them. Same rules apply. Fill them up with a big belly full of hay or something safe, and then gradually introduce them to their new environment. Herbicide use is also a risk factor. So whenever plants wilt, they tend to get yummier. So some of the reason behind this is that some herbicides actually contain hormones that encourage the plant to grow itself to death. And so what this does is it sucks carbohydrates up from the roots of the plant and puts it in the leaf. And so it gets more sugary and nicer to eat. And as part of the wilting process, some of the fibrous parts of the plants, the structural parts of the plants start to break down. And so the plant gets more readily digestible during that wilting process. So it's nicer to eat. So I've seen this with marshmallow weeds sprayed out and wilted. The animals just really loved it and really attacked it. The next risk factor in common situations are riverbanks. As we said, floodwater brings seeds and weeds and they're often uncontrolled. They're hard to get in and hard to spray. And riverbanks and flood-prone areas are a real risk for plant poisonings. And finally, gardens. So if the animals bust through the garden fence, or if we dump our garden waste, so we've trimmed the bushes and we put them over the fence. I remember when I was at Camden in my 5th year of uni, we had a client who had trimmed their daisies and put the daisies over the fence, and they were toxic to the cattle. So a lot of ornamental plants or garden plants do have some toxic principles. We'll talk about some of them throughout the presentation, but just always get rid of your garden waste and your trimmings in a really safe way away from your livestock. Now, look, I wasn't going to cover perennial ryegrass toxicity because it's well out of my field of expertise and I've never seen a case and it's well out of the area that I work in. But I felt that I had to just mention it because it was the highest ranked plant toxicity on the list of endemic sheep diseases. And the reason it's the most common is because it's the most commonly planted grass pasture in southern Australia. So it's really the high rainfall zones, so southern New South Wales and down into Victoria. And it's not so much the plant itself that's toxic, it's the fungus that lives on the plant. And this fungus has no negative effect on the plant, but it does cause disease in animals, so particularly the staggers. And it can also affect blood flow to the skin and the animals can overheat. So often these animals don't actually die of the staggers, they die of misadventure. They wander into dams or they fall over and they can't get up or they get stuck in a fence or something like that. And it can occur in all different types of animals, so horses, cattle, sheep, alpacas and deer. And there has been really big outbreaks. So for example, in 2002, about 100,000 sheep and 500 cattle died due to perennial ryegrass toxicity in Victoria. So from time to time, this is a really big issue across southern Australia and worth thinking about. The reason that I wanted to mention it now is because the risk factors really are summer and autumn, which we're in, and when there's abundant pasture growth followed by hot spells during the summer and the autumn period, and when the perennial ryegrasses become a monoculture. So I know a lot of those southern areas are in drought, but it just might be worth looking at what grows after the drought breaks and keeping perennial ryegrass toxicity in mind. And it's just really an example of looking out for what's important in your area and getting to know it and managing those risks. So if perennial ryegrass is something that you've got in your pastures, or you're looking at establishing a new pasture, particularly post-drought, it's sometimes good to sow the newer varieties that have less of a fungus risk. Avoid handling stock in the high-risk period, so that summer and autumn period, which might mean readjusting your calendar for things like shearing. Monitoring the livestock really closely for the early signs of the staggers so that they can be moved to other safe pastures or into a feedlot if there's not enough other safe pasture, and they will recover if they're moved early enough. Monitoring weight gains of weaners, and those young stock are higher risk, so particularly keeping those high-risk animals off the paddocks during the high-risk period. And if you can't avoid it, absolutely, just provide a safe watering system, so troughs and fence off dams or anywhere that the animals can stagger into and get stuck. All right, so moving back into my territory with the things that we see, but I imagine no matter where you are, this will be something that you see. Nitrate poisonings. So generally speaking, in a normal season, I use normal in inverted commas, we don't see a lot of nitrate poisonings, but we did see a lot of nitrate poisonings during the drought from introduced haze, but also post-drought when there was rain, particularly around areas where there were high stock concentrations. And this sort of poisoning is not exclusive to one type of plant. So I've given you a big list there of plants that can have high nitrates and cause death. So cathead, pigweed, and that's exactly what you're looking at there. This was a little block on the edge of town, and they had a few sheep, pet sheep, and it had been really, really dry, and then they'd got some rain, and then the first thing that grew were these tiny little shoots of cathead and pigweed, and all of a sudden they had some dead animals. I've also seen castor oil plants do this around breaks on stock routes. Other sorts of plants are couch grass, button grass, sorghum, oats crops, capeweed, thistles. Basically, whatever you can think of that's sort of green and actively growing, particularly around high stock manure areas, that could be a nitrate poisoning risk. And as I said, we did see this in hay. Things like canola hay are also quite a risk. So what is nitrate poisoning? It usually presents as sudden death in animals. And the way that nitrates usually work is that the nitrates are accumulated, that they're present in the soil. That's what NO3 stands for. That's a nitrate molecule. And as the plant grows, it sucks the nitrates up from the soil, and the sun, it uses the energy from the sun during the process of photosynthesis to convert those nitrates into ammonia and then into plant proteins. So that's a good thing, and that's how it's meant to work. But if we start to have plants grow in an area where there is really high levels of nitrate in the soil, particularly so through high fecal contamination or fertilizer application, or if there's some other mineral issues in that area, so for example, low sulfur or low molybdenum in the soil, the nitrates accumulate. And then if we happen to get, say, an overcast day where there's not a lot of photosynthesis occurring, the nitrates can't be adequately converted into the plant proteins, and so they build up in high numbers in the tissues. Now, if a hungry animal comes along and eats that, they're going to get high nitrates in their rumen. And these nitrites are converted by the rumen bugs into nitrites. And these, if the rumen bugs aren't fed properly, so in terms of carbohydrate and sugars and things to rev up the rumen bugs, these nitrites just can't be dealt with, and they spill over into the bloodstream, and they convert the nice red oxygen-carrying hemoglobin into the dirty brown non-oxygen carrying meth hemoglobin. And this means that the blood cells can no longer carry oxygen to the tissues, And so they can't keep up blood supply and oxygen supply to those tissues, and the animals, their vital organs quite quickly become starved of oxygen, and the animals most often die suddenly. Sometimes they can pant and have some, staggers and convulsions, but most commonly death is the quick result. So you might have to use your imaginoscope for this picture, but I can kind of see that those mucous membranes are brown and a bit discoloured. Hope you can too. They're usually quite brown immediately post-death, and then the brown dissipates with time. So, and it's really hard, obviously, in a black animal. It's easier in animals with normally pink mucous membranes to see this, but they do get like a muddy brown mucous membrane. Now, we can take some samples. So usually we do this on, say, an eye fluid sample, but we've got these little dipsticks that are quite cool. And if we dip that in their eye fluid post-death and those little dipsticks turn purple, we can see that that animal is positive for nitrates. So that's just a really handy in the paddock test to give you a result. And this is an example of some sheep that were let out post-drought from a set of yards onto some high nitrate green weeds, which is, again, probably pigweed and catheads. And yeah, they've had a fairly significant mortality rate as a result. So what do? We can also send samples to the lab, and they can test for things like nitrates in the eye fluid again. And the other thing that we can do is we can actually test plant materials. So here we've tested the pigweed and the cathead, and they're very high for nitrates. So above about 5,000 milligrams is high. So we've got some quite high levels there. Now, this is always worth doing if you're buying hay to test for nitrates. But be advised that even though it's got high nitrates, we could dilute that in the diet with other things. So we could feed different grains or different hays, or we could dilute it down and still use it. Or the rumen bugs can make use of those nitrates if they're fed well and if they're accustomed slowly to it. So a high nitrate doesn't exclude it. It just means that it's risky and we need to manage it. Managing that could mean avoiding it, but it also could be diluting it or changing it in the diet with other things. So nitrate poisoning is a disease best avoided. You can treat individual animals, but the treatment is not really recommended for use in food-producing species, so that's an issue. And the other thing is it's just very difficult to get the animals before they die. It's just a very rapidly progressive disease that usually results in sudden death. So that's, nitrates usually just avoiding those types of high-risk situations, so overcast days, high fertiliser or high fecal contamination plants, hungry animals, and a big belly full all at once. This is just the perfect storm because we've got an overcast day in winter, we've got a monoculture of a cereal crop, which could itself have high nitrates, but we've also got variegated thistles all the way along this fence line boundary that have been sprayed. So they're all wilted and they're delicious and yummy. And we know the animals that are put on here are going to be seeking alternatives to the monoculture. So that is just the perfect storm of a situation. And there's a dead one just to prove the point. So yeah, tricky to manage, but maybe some hay and some introduction on a sunny day, those type of things could potentially help that. Or spray the weeds before the animals actually move into the paddock and let all the leaves fall off before they're introduced. All right, we're moving on. I know there'll probably be questions, but we'll get to them at the end. I now want to talk about pyridine alkaloids, which is something that I struggle to say, so we'll call them PA toxicities from here on in. And there's actually a few plants that will cause these. So heliotropes, blue and common heliotrope, Patterson's curse, which some people call Salvation Jane, fireweed, ironweed, and rattlepods. Now, these sorts of plants cause liver damage. That's primarily how they operate. And I know that there were some pre-webinar questions about alpacas. Now, alpacas just need to be considered along with all of the other, along with the sheep in all of these sorts of plant poisonings. They're not special, they are affected just like sheep. But in terms of the PAs, alpacas actually have a smaller liver than sheep or cattle. So they're a bit more prone to these sorts of things that hurt their liver function. And on the other hand, goats actually have a bigger liver. That liver has developed in order to process toxins from the plants that they browse out of the environment, so the tree leaves and all those sorts of things that they browse. And so goats are a little bit more, I suppose, immune to plant toxicities. They're a bit more able to deal with them. So still be really careful of risk factors, but yeah, there's just a little bit of species differentiation there. So these type of plants, as I said, damage the liver. They are usually cumulative, so they build up over time. So it could be from the signs that you see could be from continuous grazing day after day, and sometimes they can have just clinical signs pop up all of a sudden. So it can be a confusing disease process, and a good grazing history that goes back 12 or 18 months is usually necessary. So this is just a picture. This is a case that I saw. That the picture on the left is just a. I'll just go back a slide. These pictures are just from Flock and Herd, which is a great website of cases put together by the LLS vets. And these pictures are from Dan Salmon, and it just shows jaundice. So this sheep here has got a yellow mucus or yellow sclera around his eye. And this sheep has got really jaundiced or yellow subcutaneous fat. And the reason that that occurs is because the liver is damaged, and the liver's job is to process all of the toxins out of the bloodstream. And without doing that, the toxins build up, and this animal's dying of liver failure. So that's icterus or jaundice caused by liver failure. The other thing that it can actually happen is that the liver has got a main role in copper metabolism, and sometimes these sorts of plants cause copper to build up, and then all of a sudden the copper gets released into the bloodstream. So sometimes the result of these types of poisonings is not just due to liver failure, it's due to sudden copper toxicity due to a massive release of toxin by the damaged liver cells. So these can be very interesting and quite confusing for a vet to diagnose because of the multitude of things that are happening inside these animals that give rise to the clinical signs. This is an example that I saw at Narromine a couple of years ago. As you can see, still a very yellow carcass, so yellow subcutaneous fat. And that liver is really small and really shrunken and really hard when you go to touch it. So it's in full-blown liver failure. Its liver is cirrhotic and pretty small and pretty hard. And these ewes had been used as farming implements over the summer and been put on stubble. And this is a picture of the stubble on the right-hand side. So it's stubble and leaf litter and all those sorts of things. And here, the only green plant in the whole paddock is common heliotrope. So that is what they had been snacking on their entire summer. And so after a few months, they started to die. And the horrible thing about this disease is that the liver damage is usually permanent. And so unlike some of the other disease syndromes where you've got staggers or those sorts of things, they will recover if you remove them from the plant. But this disease, usually the results are permanent. So even if they're not dead, they're usually, and anything with liver failure generally does poorly. They're skinny, they don't put on much weight, they never do as well, and they have ongoing chronic complications from that. So we always, just want to be aware of these PA plants in the environment. They'll usually avoid them in a mixed pasture species where there's plenty of good stuff to eat. But if they're forced to eat them in this stubble, like you can see in this stubble situation, it becomes an issue. And I just popped a close-up picture from the net there of blue heliotrope. Just both common and blue heliotrope are toxic, but that's just a bit of a close-up view of what the flower looks like. All right. Now, I want to talk about humpyback, which is a problem that we see in northwest New South Wales and southern Queensland, and it has puzzled sheep vets and graziers for about the last 70 or 80 years. So it was first diagnosed in the 1950s. It's commonly called humpyback because the animals tend to get this real hump in their back, and they have a very arched stance, and when they walk, they're very tucked up. And over the years, there's not been a lot of solid research done. There's been some feeding trials back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and there's been a lot of case reports written by some of the vets that have worked out in Western areas. And those case reports and those feeding trials have sort of tentatively linked together this particular plant, which is called Solanum essurale, or wild tomato or quena. It's also linked together, I'll just go back. It's also linked together the heat, the breed of the sheep, and the wool length. So we'll talk more about that shortly, but it's quite a syndrome where there's been not a lot of solid research done, and a lot of Western graziers just deal with it when it occurs. This is a video. I hope that your internet connection and my internet connection is good enough to show this to you without it being all staggery, but just keep your eye on the sheep on the right-hand side. So you can see that it's already tucked up, and then it's got this really arched back, and it's got a really sort of funny tucked up, shuffly gait. Yeah, and its mate there is in the way at the end. Oh. But as we said, it's been linked to this particular plant, Solanum essurale. It's related to the tomato family. It gets this little berry on it. Most of the feeding trials have attributed the berry to the disease syndrome, and that's certainly what I see. Out here, it usually occurs after Christmas, so between about December and May. And the animals, so it's usually full wool merinos in summer when they're heat stressed. So they're usually walked in for shearing or drenching, and the animals get that true arch in their back and their hump, and they lay down. They have exercise intolerance. And sometimes it's mistaken for Barber's pole worm. The producer assumes that they're weak because they've got worms, and so they hurriedly move them all to the yards and get busy drenching. But that's often the worst thing that you can do. These guys are best left alone. And so the producers who deal with it all the time just generally try to arrange their management calendar so that they're not moving full wool merinos in the heat of the summer when that plant is around. So that might mean that they move their shearing, or they move their crutching, or they work their worm control program out so that they don't have to walk their sheep long distances. Now, there's some thoughts in the literature that this has actually got nothing to do with the plant, and that it is purely a heat stress thing. And there's just been such little solid research done to prove that one way or the other. But I certainly know it's widely talked about in veterinary circles, and it's something that we see in a lot of summers, and we've seen a couple of cases this summer. All right, cathead is another disease that plagues us during summer, or another plant, I should say. They're not great in your feet. They go straight through your thongs if you haven't got the big tread ones, but they also cause 3 different disease syndromes in our livestock. So the first being photosensitization, which, because the animals get such swollen heads and the swellings start to leach serum, which is yellow, it often gets given the name yellow big head when it's caused by cathead. We're going to talk more about photosensitization as a broad term in just a minute. But when cathead causes it, we tend to call it yellow big head. The second disease it causes is tubular staggers, which is mainly seen in British bred sheep, so particularly, say, Border Leicesters, and it causes a particular type of staggers that's irreversible. And then the third case that we see is Coonabarabran staggers. Now, this obviously occurs around the Coonabarabran area in central west New South Wales. We see it out here a bit as well, but it's a more broad type of the staggers that occurs in all types of breeds of sheep, merinos, etc. And it is actually reversible when they're removed from the plant. It's pretty tricky to diagnose, but we do see it during certain times of the year. We haven't seen any this year, even though we have had a big we have had a big summer rainfall. We've had lots of other species of plants grow. So we haven't actually seen any types of poisonings from cathead just this summer. So there's just some pictures of the plants. So there are a couple of different types of catheads. So Tribulus terrestrius tends to cause the tribulus staggers, which is in the Border Leicester type sheep, and Tribulus micrococcus tends to cause the true like the Coonabarabran type staggers in the other breeds of sheep. So identifying your plants can sometimes be useful, but again, avoiding eating a large monoculture of catheads. So for example, if you put them into a set of cattle yards or sheep yards or something like that, and they just hoover up whatever's there, that would be a particular risk factor. Over here on the left, we've got the Slalom skier and the sheep that's doing the same thing. And that's your true Tribulus terrestrius staggers. So it's permanent and irreversible, and it typically affects your British bred sheep. And they tend to just get worse and worse. So they'll go to they'll stagger always the one way, so that their legs will be permanently kind of bent that way. And to start with, they'll just go a little bit that way, and then eventually the only way they can remain upright is to lean against a tree. And they're generally euthanized at that point. So that's from the Tribulus terrestrius. I haven't actually got a picture of the Coonabarabran staggers, which is just a more general staggers in different breeds of sheep. But on the right there, I've got a picture of cathead photosensitization, which we commonly call yellow big head. They get really swollen, really scabby, and the swelling is pretty painful, and the swellings tend to leak and leach yellow sort of serum fluid. So these guys need some fairly intensive nursing care. So some pain relief, some non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and some shade, and we need to give them something to eat that isn't catheads or isn't lush green stuff that's going to contribute further to the poisoning. So now that we've mentioned photosensitization, I just wanted to focus in on it a bit more. The first type of photosensitization is primary photosensitization. So it's a severe inflammatory reaction in the deep skin layers caused by a reaction between the sunlight and a plant-derived pigment. So for example, St. John's wort. So there's not a lot of plants that cause primary photosensitization. Probably St. John's wort is the main one, and it's definitely something that producers who live in an area with St. John's wort spend a lot of time trying to deal with and trying to get rid of that plant. But luckily for us, there's not a lot of primary photosensitization plants. However, secondary photosensitization is very, very common. So it's a similar reaction, but it's with chemicals that have built up because of either impaired liver function. So this could go hand in hand with a PA poisoning, or it could go hand in hand with, say, pregnancy toxemia or malnutrition in late pregnancy, where the animals aren't getting enough food. They're mobilizing body fat to try to deal with the fact that they're not getting enough food, and their liver is becoming impaired because of the fat buildup. So we need to, so in those cases, we probably need to look at the impaired liver function. But the list there on the right is just out of my very weathered Hungerford's Diseases of Livestock textbook, but it's a list of common plant toxicities that are caused by secondary photosensitization, that cause secondary photosensitization. And the list is as long as your arm, because all of those plants are lush and green and contain heaps of chlorophyll. So it could be an oats crop. It could be lucerne. It could be the most delicious thing that's the best thing in the world for the nutrition of those animals, but yet we've got too much chlorophyll and it's overwhelming the liver's ability to deal with it. It's building up in the skin and it's causing photosensitization. So this is a case that I saw at Gilgandra in August a couple of years ago. And it was probably the worst case of photosensitization I think I've ever seen. It just affected a lot of animals and they were burnt all over their bodies. Usually photosensitization just occurs in the non-wooled areas and in the non-pigmented areas. But these guys were burnt on their backs and in lots of different spots. So this was lucerne, and it was lucerne flats with not many trees, not much shade. And so they were heavily exposed to the UV radiation, and it was definitely a big monoculture of lucerne. So there were no other plants, and they had really severe photosensitization. Now, down on the Monaro, there is a particular type of aphid called cowpea aphid, which is linked to these cases of severe photosensitization on lucerne. And we looked and looked in this particular case. We got the agronomist in, we sent plant samples away, we looked and looked for the aphid and we didn't find it. So we don't think that it was related in this particular case, and we're certainly a long way from the Monaro. But we think that this was just a secondary photosensitization from just an extreme amount of chlorophyll and an extreme amount of UV sunlight. So these animals recovered. We moved them from the paddock and we fed them something that wasn't green, that wasn't full of chlorophyll, so some cereal hay that was like a brown colour, and gave the really severe ones some antibiotics if they had cracked, damaged pieces of skin, and some pain relief, and yeah, they recovered really well. So it is reversible when they're removed from the plant source, which is a good thing. Now, I just wanted to talk about garden plants. I've included green cestrum here. So green cestrum is very, very toxic. This year, just in my local area, I know it's killed cattle and it's killed horses. Haven't heard of any sheep, but there's no reason why they couldn't be killed from it. It's very toxic. And even though we mainly see that on riverbanks and in paddocks adjoining river country or anywhere there's floodwater that washes, this did start its life as a garden plant, and you still do find it in some people's gardens. So it's a nice, bright leafed, glossy plant. It's got a yellow flower on it, and it gets a black or a purple berry on it. And it's very deadly, and it causes liver dysfunction as well, a kind of different dysfunction to the PA toxicity, but extremely acute liver dysfunction all the same, and sudden death. So very deadly. Next is oleander, which is just a nice hardy plant to grow around gardens, but very toxic to animals. It causes cardiac effects. And I think over the years, it's been attributed to killing a few Boy Scouts as well, who thought they'd make their kebabs out of the stalks of the oleander plants. It's not a very good idea. So even if you're handling it in your garden, wash your hands, and definitely don't chuck these in the scrap heap where the stock can access them. And finally there, I've just put white cedar. So white cedar is listed in the textbooks as toxic, and it's widely believed in livestock circles to be toxic. It's commonly planted around sheep yards and feedlots and, livestock areas, and it doesn't commonly cause toxicity. However, I think I was only talking to a farmer about this morning. Animals that are actually hungry, that are forced to eat that, there's nothing else there, they're left in the yards a bit too long, and that's all that they've got, we definitely can get plant poisonings under those conditions. So I hope you're getting the running theme here that, there's some particular risk factors for plant toxicities. Not everything's toxic, and hungry bellies is a big risk factor. So just beware all your garden plants, any ornamentals, anything that looks pretty generally could be toxic. Now, marshmallow is a pretty flexible plant. It can cause nitrate poisoning, but it also can cause a particular type of staggers. And we've seen 2 big marshmallow winters here in the last 10 years, where we've seen staggers affect a lot of sheep across the district. So every now and then we just get the right conditions. So there's a close-up of a marshmallow plant growing in our veggie garden. And this is just some kids hiding in it. It does get really tall. And even when it's dried and there's a little marshmallow kernel on it, it can be toxic even when it's just a dried stalk if the animals are allowed to eat enough of it. So this is typically a winter growing plant. So most of our toxicity cases occur between July to October. And it's when the plant has made up a large portion of their diet for days or weeks. But we have seen cases in baby lambs where they've been yarded with their mothers for, say, lamb marking, and they've smashed the marshmallow that's in the stockyards overnight, and then they've been too staggery to mark the next morning. So it can be a more chronic thing or it can be a sudden thing. And it doesn't just affect the animal that eats the plant, it actually can be passed through the mother's milk. So if you have a look at this next video, this is a little baby lamb at foot that's been affected by marshmallow poisonings, and they get this really particular type of stagger. Poor little mate. So the good news is that they do recover when they're removed from the plant. So it's not permanent and it rarely kills them. They usually recover once they're given other things to eat. So sometimes the symptoms appear, as I said, when they're yarded, but it can occur after you've mustered them some distance. And they typically get that stiff sort of tremory all over their body sort of action. Adults can actually just go down. So I actually saw a case where the producer had sprayed out an airstrip with herbicide, and all the marshmallow plants had wilted. And of course, we talked about the risk factors for wilting plants, but those marshmallow plants then looked delicious. So the stock were put into the airstrip paddock and they just hoovered up all the wilted marshmallow, and they had quite a number of ewes that went down from that with a sort of stagger syndrome. But they did recover once they were given something else to eat, and we diluted that toxin in their bloodstream. So there's also not a lot known about this particular type of poisoning. It's some of the textbooks attribute it to a compound called malvic acid, but it's been around for a long time. So it was first talked about in 1895, and then they proved it in feeding trials in the 1920s. And there's been one case written up in the Australian Veterinary Journal in 2006. Here at Canambla it comes in waves. So we saw it in 2013, we saw it in 2020. And it's a disease syndrome that's only seen in Australia. So maybe we have a different biotype of plant than what is grown elsewhere in the world. We don't really know the toxic principle, but it is attributed sometimes to malvic acid, and it's a bit hard to diagnose on gross post-mortem. So with ewes in particular, it tends to affect the hind legs. With those little lambs, it can affect all the lambs. And if you do get to look at one of them, sometimes the muscle bellies just look pale. There's nothing too noticeable about them. But I guess if you were in an area where selenium deficiency and white muscle disease was something that you dealt with, that might be your differential diagnosis, and it would be worth taking some samples and looking for selenium deficiency just to rule that out. But when we take samples of the muscles, we get degeneration and necrosis. So necrosis just means cell death. Degeneration just means that the muscle cells are breaking down, and that is a section of a muscle belly under a microscope that shows that. And the heart muscle is, well, this affects muscles. So the heart is a really big muscle in the body, and so if the animal is badly enough affected, or if there's a lot of pressure on its heart muscle, so for example it's mustered at a fairly high rate and not just allowed to poke along, they can have a heart attack. And so that's often how we come by post-mortem, is that one's died. And we can see those lesions not only in the skeletal muscle but also in the heart. And if we take a blood sample, we see high CK. So CK is a blood marker called creatinine kinase, and it typically gets high wherever there's muscle damage. So that's quite an interesting disease that comes around here in waves. Now, I thought I'd just mention nardoo poisoning as well. So nardoo, I think this has gotten much more common in the last sort of 5 years around this area. So particularly post drought. Last time the drought broke, we ended up with water and swampy areas, and this particular plant called nardoo grew, and it really hasn't gone away. So it's still there in its dried form now that we're in a dry type of season, but as soon as we get rain, and it'll be back and flourishing. And it's this 4-leaf clover, and it grows in swampy sort of waterlogged areas, and it's got some really fine hairs on the leaves. And all parts of the plant are actually toxic, and it contains a thiaminase. So thiaminases can actually be found in lots of different plants. And so even if you don't have nardoo at your place, you may have other plants that contain thiaminases. And thiaminases break down B vitamins in the rumen, particularly the B vitamin called thiamine. And thiamine is absolutely essential for brain function. So without it, the animals have a deranged brain activity. So they head press into fences, they go and stand in a corner with their head pressed against the fence, they exhibit blindness, and they exhibit incoordination. So this was first described in the veterinary literature in 1911. There were lots of cases around northwest New South Wales, particularly up around Moree in the wet years of the 1970s, where it affected thousands of sheep on many properties. And we saw it in 2021 in Coonamble. Now, they will ignore this plant. They'll try and eat around it. The case that I remember most prominently was, again, a monoculture, so a cereal crop that ran down into a swamp, and they hadn't planted in the swamp just because of, the inability to get machinery in there and all those sorts of things. So that was sort of the area where the animals were camping, and of course they don't like the monoculture, so they go and eat whatever's there, and there was a lot of nardoo in that swamp. And so we saw some quite neurological sheep. Now the good news is that they respond to thiamine injections. So we just have to circumvent that rumen breakdown process. So we try and avoid putting the thiamine into the rumen. So in licks and things like that, we try and give them injections to these sick animals, and then we move the stock away from the nardoo plants, and we don't get any further issues. And I just thought I'd throw in here, incidentally, that Burke and Wills, the famous explorers, this plant was attributed to their deaths in the 1860s in Central Australia. So it was thought that they sort of had watched what the Indigenous people had done in terms of making flour from the sporochetes, or the reproductive part of these plants, but they'd sort of missed a vital step, which I believe is heating that up. And so whatever they did, they didn't do it right, and they ate the nardoo, and it actually resulted in the clinical signs of thiamine deficiency in those two explorers before their deaths, and was attributed to contributing to their deaths. So it's quite an interesting plant that grows out in these sorts of western areas at different times, particularly following large amounts of rain. So we've covered quite a number of plants there, and groups of plants, and toxic principles. But I just want to come back to the basics, which is managing your nutritional risk of poisoning. So I've just put up here, this is just a pasture growth rate chart for Central West New South Wales, and you can get these from the Evergraze website for lots of different areas across the country, and it's worth having a look at it for your property or for your area, because it helps you to identify risk factors. So for example, we're here at Coonamble in March, and we're in what I call the autumn feed gap. So all of our summer plants are finishing and going to seed, and none of our winter plants have grown yet. So our animals are a bit hungry. So it's a particularly risky time for us in terms of plant poisoning, because they'll be chasing whatever's green. And it's just interesting that we can sort of set our farm calendar up to avoid certain times of the year and to capitalise on plant growth or highly nutritious plant growth at different times of the year. And then we can start to identify risk factors for your particular part of the world. So I think one of the questions was, are we going to be given a handout, or like, what about a calendar of risk for the year? And it's just beyond the scope of a 1-hour webinar to provide that for producers across a wide range of environmental conditions. So I would just leave you with some top tips for how to work that out for yourself. Just really noticing your land and your country and what plants you grow and the risks associated with that. And being really careful around grazing monocultures, managing hungry stock, looking at nutritional deficiencies, so not only minerals, but energy and protein when things get tight, and managing your garden waste. But also developing a good relationship with your vet, or and/or your agent, your fellow producers, your LLS, your agronomist, all of those sorts of people that surround your farm and your business, because they'll know what's happening in your district. We get to talk to heaps of different people, and we know exactly what's going on, and we get to investigate illness and death, so we know what's a risk at certain times of the year. So really take care after yarding or handling stock, after spraying, if you go and buy stock and they come onto your farm off a truck, after rain, or after drought. And I'll leave it there. I've absolutely lost track of the time, but I will leave it there. Thanks for having me, Fiona.
Thanks, Gillian. That was great. Sorry, I was just copying some information across from somebody to send to you, some feedback. One of the questions. All up to date.
Oh, I might have timed this really well. I haven't left much time for questions.
No, well done. Thank you everyone for sending through those questions, and we've got quite a few that have come through. So I'll kick straight off. It was a great presentation, and quite a few comments have come through just thanking you because it was super informative. I really enjoyed it, and it looks like everyone else did too. One comment, will there be a recording? Yes, absolutely. All our webinars are recorded and on our website. It takes a few days for us. We top and tail it, so it's a shorter version. And we just get rid of all the intro and everything. So it'll probably take a week to get this one up, but it won't be too far away. So watch the website. So first question, are there additional risks when fodder is grown in cotton trash? It's notoriously high in nitrogen and used a lot in the north of New South Wales.
I don't have any first-hand experience with that, but I would imagine yes. The other thing you've got to just be wary of with cotton trash is residues. But yeah, I would imagine anything high in nitrogen will give you a nitrate poisoning risk as well.
Most of our comments coming through are that everyone really enjoyed the presentation and it was a great session. So bit of feedback for you there.
Thank you.
I've seen a number of hobby flocks with photosensitization. Is it best to call the vet rather than self-treat?
Oh, it is, yes, because there's other skin lesions, you know, that it might not be photosensitization, and there are some exotic diseases that we would also always want to rule out, like blue tongue, or not so much with sheep, but with cattle, say lumpy skin disease and things like that. So yes, you'd always want to call your vet. And the other thing about if it truly is photosensitization is sometimes you need pain relief and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and these are vet only. So you might need to access some of those drugs for pain relief in those animals. So that's always worth contacting your vet about as well.
Thanks, Jill. Are there any early symptoms of nitrate poisoning, or is it just straight death?
It is really sudden, but staggers, gasping, and I mean they're dying of oxygen deprivation. Their tissues are being starved of oxygen, so they do try to gasp and get air, but yeah, that, and sometimes bellowing as well, and going down. But yes, and sometimes they die with terminal convulsions, so they might paddle around and things like that. But typically, it is quite a quick thing.
Doesn't sound pleasant at all. Would the humpyback poisoning be potentially attributed to silverleaf nightshade as well?
I've never read about that in the literature, and I've never seen that, but the silverleaf nightshade plant is closely related, I believe, to the Solanum esturale plant. So it's just such an unknown disease. And when you read some of the old feeding trials, they fed some animals the actual berry or the tomato, and they fed some animals the leaf and the stem, and the animals fed the leaf and the stem jacked up and refused to eat it, whereas the ones that ate the berries just smashed it and loved it. So if that silverleaf nightshade doesn't have a berry on it, I would imagine that they may not be that interested in it as well, which would reduce its risk factor.
How would you introduce hay that's high in nitrates? Do you have a method that you'd employ for that?
Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. I went out to some merino weaners that had been brought in. Well, I think they'd actually been brought in for weaning. So they'd been pulled off their mums and put onto canola hay, and they were dying of nitrate poisoning. And the reason is that they'd come off really, really dry pasture. And so you can imagine those rumen bugs are battling, and they're a bit sluggish, and they're not doing their job, and they're not working too hard. And so then they're jammed onto a high nitrate hay that needs a lot of, that they need a lot of rumen microbes to make use of all those nitrates. So what we did for those guys was we still used the canola hay, but we just trail fed them some barley so that they ate that first. And that, well, it filled them up. So we did it carefully so we didn't induce grain poisoning. But we basically, filled up their megajoule intake requirement for the day with something that wasn't high in nitrate, so the barley, but also the barley's high in starch. So rumen bugs love readily fermentable carbohydrates. So after we'd stimulated their rumen microbes and filled them up a bit, then we could slowly introduce the canola hay back into the diet. And that was totally fine and completely used up on that farm. So yeah, I probably if you're buying hays, if you can always get a feed test, and then you know your risk, and then if you do have a high nitrate test, I would dilute it down with something, even if you gave them some low risk hay first, and then some higher risk hay later. But it would depend on the nitrate level and what you've got in store in terms of your other feeds. So probably some tailored advice for the individual situation might be the go as well.
Great, thanks, Jill. That brings us to the end of question time. Thanks everybody for the great questions. And Gillian, thank you for the great presentation. There's so much feedback in the comments section about how wonderful and informative it was. So everybody's enjoyed the presentation today, so it's been great to have you.
Thank you. I'm pleased everyone enjoyed a little trip around Northwest New South Wales with me today. See you next time.